Welcome everyone to the IGDS Lunchtime Seminar Series. And we're really excited today to have this presentation. The title is Gender Violence, Discrimination, and the Deaf Community of Trinidad and Tobago. And we're really pleased, and I'm really pleased to be able to present our speakers today and our presenters. Dr. Ben Braithwaite is a lecturer in linguistics in the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He coordinates a diploma in Caribbean Sign Language Interpreting and has been doing research on sign languages and deaf cultures in the Caribbean for about 9 years. Cheryl Maniram is the president of WeCare Deaf Support Network. She was born deaf and after leaving school became the first deaf teaching assistant in Trinidad and Tobago, a job she's done for the past 33 years.
34.
34 years. And Dhanoolal is the president of the Deaf Empowerment and Advancement Foundation. He was also born deaf. He teaches Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language at the University of the West Indies and elsewhere. He's conducted research on deaf communities and sign languages around the Caribbean and campaigned for recognition of the rights of deaf citizens. So welcome, I'm Angelique Nixon. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And it's really a pleasure to have all of us today, and we're looking forward to our conversation.
Going to stay seated for our presentation. Good afternoon, just checking the time. Good afternoon, everyone. And so our presentation, as Angelique said, is about gender violence and discrimination in the deaf community in Trinidad and Tobago. And we're going to introduce ourselves. You can see on the slide we have our sign names there. So my name is Ben, and I want to add anything? Maybe. Already finished talking about it. My surname is like this, Ian. And this is my surname, Cheryl. You might wonder why we're talking about our sign names, because, you know, hearing people, they might call each other using a name, but deaf people don't work like that. Deaf culture is a little bit different from that. So deaf people have their own way of doing things. So we have our own name signs. We have Marsha and Paulson are here today, have name signs as well. And also, you know, you might call someone M for Marsha or something like that, but there might be two people called Marsha or two people called M. So what deaf people do is they will look at someone, look at their face, look at their body, and come up with a sign that kind of matches them. You know, deaf people can't hear, so Marsha's name there is Marsha because she's black, because you get dark black skin. So usually it will draw upon visual things, it will draw upon how people look. Deaf people would describe, okay, exactly how that person looks. Okay, she's skinny, she's got dark skin, whatever. And the name sign will often be based on that. And I'm just asking Cheryl where her name sign comes from. Her name sign comes because she's so pretty, so her sign for Cheryl is something like that. And so the kids in class gave me that name sign when I was young. And it continued to this day. Okay, so on this slide, you'll see in the bottom, we had a march, WeCare Deaf Support Network, which Cheryl's president of, had a march around the Savannah in Port of Spain. And the purpose of that march was really deaf awareness, raising awareness of the issues that face deaf people. And you know that this year, around that same Savannah in Port of Spain, there was another march campaigning about issues facing women, especially in Trinidad and Tobago. And actually, Ben got a call when that march was happening this year, asking if he could come and interpret for it. And he wasn't able to come, but there was also another problem, which was that deaf people hadn't really been involved in the planning of that event. Deaf people mostly didn't know about it, they didn't know what was going on. So we thought it was important to start some communication, perhaps start some partnerships between people. Not with events like this in the future, rather than, on the day looking out and seeing any deaf people here, we can plan it together in the future, plan marches like that. Sometimes the information might be on the radio or it might be on the TV or whatever, but it might not be accessible to deaf people. They might not get that information. Yeah, Facebook tends to be better for deaf people than other things. Okay, so in the Caribbean, in North America, South America, Central America, is there only one sign language? People often think that, but no, it's not true. There are lots and lots of different sign languages in the world. For example, American Sign Language, or French Sign Language, Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, Colombian Sign Language, Honduran Sign Language, lots and lots of different sign languages around the world. It's not universal and they're not all the same. You know how there are lots of different spoken languages in the world, Hindi and French and Creole and all kinds of different spoken languages. There are also all kinds of different sign languages as well. So we just wanted to dispel a couple of myths in case anyone was not aware of that. You see, deaf people tend to be proud. They're proud of their deafness. Often hearing people will think, oh, poor you, I'm so sorry to hear that you're deaf. Oh, can I help you? How can I help you? They have a sort of dependency model of deafness. And deaf people are not interested in that. We're proud of being deaf. We can do whatever we want to do. We're totally capable. We have our own culture. We have our own language. We have our own human rights. We can go anywhere we like. We can work. We deserve equality, not pity. So we're not interested in dependence. We're interested in being independent. But hearing people often, I don't know, say sorry, or they're apologetic, or they're sorry that you were born deaf. But the way that we see it is, God made us the way that we are. We don't deserve pity. We don't need pity, and we don't want pity. Actually, it makes me very angry when people pity me. We have our bodies, we have our eyes, and we can do everything we want. We can walk fine. We're proud of who we are, and we're strong people. So, when people talk about pity to me, that gets me really angry. From a hearing perspective, you might see deaf people as people who can't hear or don't have hearing, but for deaf people, we see ourselves as visual people who take in information through our eyes. Now, when a hearing woman is pregnant and has a deaf baby, sometimes when they discover that their baby is deaf, that might be a problem. We know of many cases where babies are given away because the parents don't want them. They're left somewhere, and they're left to grow up with many problems because they sometimes they don't have a good relationship within their family. They may not have good communication within their family. They may end up feeling very frustrated, and that frustration may turn into anger. They may have problems with their self-esteem as well, all related to communication problems within their families. So again, when a baby is born, and at first the parents feel very happy, when they find out it's a deaf baby, then sometimes that changes. Might be given away to a relative or something like that. We know lots of examples of that. Yeah, and sometimes when deaf parents have a child, sometimes in Trinidad and Tobago, their family might take the child away, take the baby away, because they feel that the deaf parents are not capable of bringing up that child. And I know of many instances of that happening, where a child will grow up and they meet their parents for the first time much later in their life, and they have no relationship and they have no understanding with them. So there's lots of examples of that kind of problem happening right from the start, from when a deaf baby is first born. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce this video briefly. So both of these people are deaf. Leslie on the left is the interviewer, and Sean on the right is from Tobago. He's now moved to Trinidad. Actually, he got married here. So. Anyway, this was a while ago, this interview, and he's talking about his experiences as a teacher of deaf children. And Sean is saying, a boy came to school and he was 12. He'd reached the age of 12 and never been to school before when I saw him. He'd stayed with his parents at home, but then his parents had died. He was in Trinidad at that time, and then he went to live with his aunt in Tobago. And as I say, he'd never been to school before. And he came here to the deaf school in Tobago, and he didn't know sign language at all. So I was trying to sign to him and he didn't understand. So nothing at all. He just had some home signs, like he would gesture like this. And if he wanted to go to the loo, the toilet, he would gesture like that. And I'd have to try to teach him the signs for words, like the sign for the bathroom. And I would teach him by using pictures and visual aids and try to associate that with the sign, and eventually he picked it up. And when a deaf child is born and, say, goes to a deaf school, like the Cascade School to the deaf, then they can learn sign language. That's usually the first time they would learn sign language, so they'll pick it up from all the kids around them. They can develop very quickly. So there are schools here where sign language is available. Cheryl, for example, works at the school, and the children see her signing, they pick up from her, and they develop very quickly. But what Sean was talking about was that 12-year-old boy who had never been to school. He was so far behind. And he didn't know sign language as a result. All he knew was pointing at things and gesturing. And that has a very serious effect on the development of the brain. It can actually cause brain damage, and as well as all the other problems associated with lack of communication. Actually, I have experience before. I was working at an organisation called Agape Deaf Centre as a teacher. And there was a woman, she was around 40, and I guess she was more oral. She used her voice a little bit, but her speech wasn't that good either. And I would sign to her, and she had no idea. She'd say mother like that, point and say. She could point at her. Just pointing, she was not able to sign. She didn't even know the sign for mother. And you could see that the effect that this language deprivation had on her, that it had actually had a physical effect on the development of her brain and had led her to be dependent. And of course, this lack of communication can have all kinds of other problems as well. So like if you get sick, or you need to look after yourself, you need medicine or something like that. In all kinds of ways, deaf people without access to early language can be dependent and can have all kinds of problems. This is a newspaper report. Because often we've had a problem where in schools, in mainstream schools, there'll be a deaf child trying to lip read but without an interpreter present. And you can imagine, once the teacher, the back of the teacher's head is facing you because the teacher's writing on the board, the deaf student's completely stuck. They can't understand. It's very hard for them when there's no interpreter. It's extremely frustrating. When they come to get a test, they're likely to fail the test because they have had no interpreter, no information. My own experience, I had an interpreter, but there was only one person working, and there were 5 deaf students in the school. And we'd have to move between different students. So there might be one student in an English class and then 3 students in another class, and it's not possible for the interpreter to cover all of those places at the same time. And sometimes the interpreter just wouldn't come to class. So I'll be stuck in class trying to copy whatever the person next to me was doing, but I wouldn't be understanding what was happening. When it comes to CXC, I passed technical drawing, but English and maths, I failed. I took them again the next year, and I did okay in maths. I passed maths, but again, English, I didn't pass. And that was because I missed so much information, because of the lack of interpreting support and lack of sufficient interpreting support. And this is not just in my time. Recently, you might have seen there's a boy on the TV, there was a report about a child in southeast Port of Spain school. And the special teacher who was working there had resigned, and there was no one there to support that boy. And the parents were complaining a lot. And there was an interview on TV6 recently about the need for interpreters in school in Trinidad and Tobago. And really the Ministry of Education ought to be responsible for those kinds of things. Some deaf children are able to pass SEA, but others fail because of all the problems in the education system. And what happens to them then is they're often placed in tech VOC places, skills training centres, which is fine, that can be fine, but there can also be problems. There sometimes have been problems with safety. You have very young students, 12 or 13, going into these skills training centres, and they find themselves in environments in which there are much older people around, 18, 19-year-olds, and there have been cases of them being harassed or abused in those places, feeling uncomfortable in those places, because they're not with children of their own age group sometimes. So that's one of the consequences, one of the risks associated with some of the problems in the education system. Let me just start this over. Okay, in this next video, again, it's an interview with two people, but we're focusing on the deaf woman and her experiences when she left school. What happens next? She say, I want to learn things, I'm interested in UE, in CXCs, interested in graphics and art, but there's just no support for deaf people. English and maths, CXC, I want to pass those, but it's difficult to learn when there's no support, there's no interpreters. So I've searched in different places and haven't been able to find anything, especially for English and maths, learning those. So I'm really excited for training, but there are no opportunities. And you see that experiences that deaf people have when they leave school. Often they want to learn graphics or nail design or English or maths or all kinds of other things. Actually, just recently, just today, I was at a meeting in the department here at UE, Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, and I made the suggestion that UE has programs for like an English language program to prepare deaf people, or an access program from secondary school in order to give deaf students the opportunities to, say, pass CXCs, which they didn't pass at school, and access university. So that's a goal, because at the moment we really have very few opportunities. A few people fly away to America. There are access programs for deaf students in America and Britain, but really we don't have anything much going on here. So I really hope that in the future we're able to establish some programs in order to give deaf people access to UE after secondary education. Okay, so this is another example of what can happen to deaf people after they go to school. So this was someone who was abandoned as a child and placed in a home, and she was a victim of abuse, sexual abuse, and she got very angry about that, obviously, and she was not able to communicate with the people. She was bullied a lot, and as a result of that she was sedated. That was how they dealt with it. And then when she was 18, she finished school, and the cycle of abuse continued. She's now around 40, and she was placed in the hospital in St Anne's and continued to suffer from abuse, continued to be sedated. And really there was nothing wrong with her. The only thing that was wrong with her, that she was deaf. There's no reason why she required this kind of treatment. But the problem was that no one was understanding her because of the sign language barrier, because people were not providing linguistic access to her. So it can lead to all kinds of really serious problems. So when babies are abandoned and they're placed in homes, that can lead to real problems. Often what will happen is there might only be one deaf child in a home, and a child might end up being bullied by the other children because they're the only deaf person, and then that can lead to problems. And usually the deaf child will not be understood. They'll get angry because of what's happening to them, but they won't be treated appropriately, and So the people who are caring for deaf children in those institutions, and all kinds of institutions, or responsible for them, need to have language support, need to have interpreters, and need to be able to communicate. And what I've spoken to people in this situation, and they said that sometimes they would try to explain what was happening to them, explain to the people running the institution what was happening to them, and they wouldn't be believed. Partly, I think, because of the communication barrier. And people would think, oh, because you're deaf, you're stupid, or you're mad. So what you need is just sedation. What you need is to be kept quiet. So this is another example of something that happened. We're talking about the justice system here. You remember the curfew a few years ago. A lot of deaf people first of all, they didn't know the word curfew, the English word curfew, and they also didn't have information about what was happening. Again, because of communication problems. And they might have communication problems when they're interacting with the police services, with other aspects of the justice system. And this happens not just in Trinidad and Tobago, it happens in other countries all across the Caribbean. This is a big problem, communication between the police service and the deaf community. And just generally information. So when there are hurricanes, when there are other kind of emergency situations, often information will be given out on the radio, and deaf people will not get that information. They might rely on their families for information, but then sometimes the families won't take the deaf person on. And they may not get the information within their own families. As we said before, the communication within the information system, within the family, is not always good. And in this particular case, the three men who were arrested on the first night of the curfew, and they spent several nights in jail because of this. So there's a problem in particular, deaf women within family situations, sometimes when within their marriages they may suffer from domestic abuse, or within their families they may be taken advantage of in particular ways. And they may want to report that to the police, but they can't because of the communication problem. How are they going to do it? It might be that their English is not good, so they can't write it. They may never have gone to school for the reasons that we've seen before. And so they may not be able to report things that are happening to them. So it might be that their abusers are just continuing with impunity and knowing that nothing is going to be done about it, again, because of all of these communication factors that we've talked about. So this is another example of something that happened. There was a deaf man at home with his brother and his father, and a quarrel broke out. And a quarrel broke out between the brother and father, and it started getting violent, and someone's arm was cut. And as a result of that, the deaf man kind of lost his cool and attacked his brother and stabbed him, and his brother ended up dying. And he gave himself in to the police. And then when he went to court, they had an interpreter, but there was communication problems with the interpreter. They had to call another interpreter, and again that was a problem as well, because this time there was a signer, but they weren't signing properly, so their facial expressions were missing. The grammar of the language was not properly rendered. And eventually the next interpreter came and explained to the judge the requirements that you have to sign in a visual way in order to communicate clearly in sign language, and explain exactly what was happening. And it was only at that point that what the deaf person was trying to say was actually clearly communicated in the court. And sometimes an interpreter came in who had a certificate, but was using American Sign Language as opposed to Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. And maybe also was creating some of her own signs. And again, that led to problems and lack of understanding. And she wasn't signing in a way that was accessible to the person in the court. And in this particular case, when the deaf defendant was asked to plead, whether he was guilty or not, there was a misunderstanding when that happened. And that led to a guilty plea nearly happening. So it's very lucky, in fact, that something was done about this. Because, of course, we have the death penalty for murder. So eventually in this particular case the guy was lucky because they managed to get someone who could do a professional job. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about health issues. Guess we have captions, so I don't need to talk. And that's not just one person's experience. Lots and lots of deaf people have that experience. When they go to the doctor, they have problems communicating. Actually, my own experience, within my family, I used to have to go with someone from my family when I was sick to the doctor. And the doctor would talk and talk and talk and talk. When he finished, I'd ask my family member, what did they say? And they'd give me, I don't know, a couple of words, and that was it. And I wouldn't understand what the problem was, I wouldn't understand what was going on, and I would feel very frustrated and angry. You know, this is my body. I need to care for my own body. I need the information to be able to do that properly. So now what I tend to do is call an interpreter who will come and interpret for me, and I get the idea, and then I'm satisfied with what's going on. But lots of people have problems in medical settings with doctors or dentists or all kinds of different medical practitioners. And this can be a particularly serious problem in case of, for example, where a woman is pregnant and needs to have clear communication with their doctor. if there are any problems with the pregnancies. So it's really crucial that you have clear communication. That doesn't always happen. So my experience, I went to Southeast Port of Spain in a mainstream school, and the teacher talked to us about safe sex and HIV and other kinds, and AIDS and other kinds of sex education. But lots of deaf people have very little information, very little access to sex education. They may not even know what STI, STD is. There might be posters, but the information is not accessible to them. Usually hearing people will get information through their ears, but deaf people don't necessarily get enough information, just a little bit. And most people in the deaf community have very little sex education. Same thing with sexual abuse. There's very little information provided to deaf people on the topic of sexual abuse. And sometimes a deaf child in a mainstream school will be in a sex education class, and the interpreter will keep pausing and missing stuff, and the deaf child will think, okay, tell me they're still talking, so what am I missing? Tell me what's going on. And the interpreter will shake their head and say, no. And then you might get another interpreter. And so talking about vaginal infection, but the first interpreter maybe doesn't want to use bad signs or bad words as they see it. They won't want to use things that they think are dirty, or they won't want to sign in a way that they don't feel comfortable with. And of course that's not acceptable, because it's not for the interpreter, it's for the deaf person, and the information is crucial. So I've had that experience myself. And we've talked a little bit about sexual abuse in the deaf community already.
One second. Just a quick question. Anybody park downstairs? Nobody? No? Nobody? Okay, because they're clamping. So. Okay, so everybody's good.
Okay, so we also want to just show you that this is not a problem for Trinidad and Tobago alone. We have just a few examples from other places in the Caribbean. So this was a recent incident in Jamaica. Some deaf people left work, 2 or 3 deaf people left work, walking down the streets, signing to each other normally. And there were some policemen, and the policemen looked at them and were making fun of their signs, mocking their signs. And making rude gestures at them, kind of copying the signs, gesturing at them, harassing the woman in particular, using kind of rude signs. And those are police officers doing that. That's something this year. I've had that experience here too. That kind of thing goes on here too. In hospitals, in offices, in different places. Guards especially, security guards, will see people signing and make fun of it, make rude gestures based on it. Sometimes you have to stand up to it. You feel like fighting sometimes when you see that. We had recently actually a meeting, our organisation had a general meeting in Tobago, and there were 4 of us sitting down having ice cream after our meeting, and two sitting opposite each other, chatting to each other, and I was sitting the other side. And we were just chatting. I didn't see anything. You saw the video of Sean before. He was the teacher from Tobago talking about the 12-year-old boy who had never learned sign language before. So he was one of the people I was with at this time. And there was a young teenager maybe. So a group of teenagers sitting across, and they were doing the same thing. They were laughing, they were looking at the sign language and laughing. And Sean noticed them. Sean himself actually uses speech sometimes, so he called them over. He said, "Well, are you laughing at our sign language? You know sign language?" And they were saying, "What?" They understood what he was saying, but they pretended to not understand. And so this sign that we were using for ice cream, it's not a rude sign, this is the sign for ice cream. Oh, the owner of that ice cream establishment, right? He explained to them, okay, these people are deaf, they communicate using sign language. And Sean was explaining, listen, this is how we communicate, you need to show us some respect and not. And then they think they were a bit scared because they felt ashamed maybe because they ran off afterwards. And the owner asked us afterwards if we were okay, and we said, yeah, we're not afraid, we just feel like we want people to respect our human rights. That's how we feel about it. This kind of thing goes on a lot in Trinidad and Tobago. So in Port of Spain, there's a group of people signing in Port of Spain, and they're hearing people standing around like mocking us, using rude gestures and stuff like that. And the deaf person just got up and started fighting, started brawling with them. And then they saw them the same people the next day, and that seemed to change how they felt about it. So that was one way of teaching them to learn some respect. So this is another example of something that happened. This is a deaf trans woman in Honduras, in Roatan, a place where we've done research before. And she was suffering from abuse, and she was eventually murdered. And this is something that happened quite recently. So again, and this has happened actually there's a very similar case that's happened in Trinidad and Tobago. Deaf person who was brutally murdered in Trinidad in the same kinds of circumstances. People saw the way he was walking, saw he was gay and murdered him in a very brutal way. So in Guatemala, this is another example. In rural areas in Guatemala, there's reports of deaf women getting abused and touched. And the same kind of thing happening. The deaf women, no one believing the deaf women, the deaf women not being able to tell anyone about it or do anything about it, and the abusers going completely unpunished. You remember before when Cheryl was talking about the woman who had been placed in St. Anne's, and the same kind of situation there, where even when she tried to report the abuse, there was nothing that could be done about it, or nothing that was done about it. And so this is a similar type of situation. And this is an experience I had. I went with a church group to Belize, working with deaf children, and then one day there were very young boys, around 8 to 10 years old, and they seemed to be engaging in sexual activities with girls. And I asked the person who I was with there, and they said, well, when they go home after the church to get dropped, they live in rural communities in far off places, usually quite isolated from each other. And you see the kind of things that happen in their homes when we drop them home with their parents. They often share a room with their mother and father, with their parents. You know, they have a separate room for cooking and a separate room for sleeping in. And they'd all sleep in the same place, all next to each other. And when the parents are having sex at night, the children will be right there watching. Or on cable TV, I saw once, the children what was being watched on the cable TV was not being monitored at all, so they were watching pornography and other kinds of things, and even being subjected to sexual abuse themselves by other members of their own families, and hearing people in the places that they live would sexually abuse them on a regular basis. And in Trinidad, I've heard about a very similar situation with a deaf boy, again being in the same room with his parents, having sex on a regular basis, and coming and telling the kids about it in my school afterwards. I feel the bed shaking and watch what was happening and see everything that was going on. And I think in that case the parents thought, well, he can't hear, he's deaf, he can't hear, so there's no harm, there's nothing to worry about, we can just do whatever we want, carry on with everything. But of course, just because he can't hear doesn't mean he can't feel. He can feel vibrations, he can feel what's going on, and he can wake up, he's not stupid, he's smart. So having talked about some of the problems, we're going to talk about some of the things that are being done, not just by us, but different organisations. So WeCare Deaf Support Network, one of the things that we've been doing is having workshops, HIV and sex education workshops, AIDS and different kinds of sexually transmitted diseases. For 4 years now we've been having these workshops and teaching about all of this important information that often deaf people are not aware of. So I think we had one this year and we're planning to do another one next year. And in the past, WeCare what I was saying before about how sometimes the interpreters don't like to talk about these things. They think it's nasty, they don't want to talk about it. So WeCare have done a lot of work in Trinidad and Tobago in trying to kind of break those taboos and try to spread better sex education. People have funny ideas, like they think sex education is porn or something like that. When of course what it's about is learning about health and well-being and safety and infections, and so that deaf people can understand and be safe and be clear. They've had 4 workshops, I think. And we're hoping to have one in Tobago as well, because there's a real need there. Another thing that we're working on is sign language training. So DEAF, Deaf Empowerment and Advancement Foundation, and UE and Caribbean Sign Language Centre have classes on sign language and deaf culture. And we think that the most important thing there is to get people practicing communicating with deaf people here and around the Caribbean as well. And we also have a mentoring program where you might have, say, a hearing person and a hearing interpreter paired up with a deaf person. So the hearing person, when they're signing badly, they're making lots of mistakes, the deaf person can say, no, don't do it like that. Look. You know, if you're signing with a completely blank face, it's not going to make sense. Right, you're trying to transmit the information that someone stabbed someone else, but you're doing it with a face that looks like you're in a kind of meditative state. So the purpose of this is for deaf people to help to mentor hearing people to become better interpreters and better signers. We actually arranged for 3 interpreter trainers to come to Trinidad a few years ago to help us, and actually that was the first time where we had training specifically for deaf interpreters, not just hearing interpreters. And since that time we've had deaf people interpreting on the news since then, including including Ian there on the budget this year, for example, and some other deaf interpreters. And what's very important with these things is people don't just take a class and then they go off and they feel like they're done. They need to keep going, take several levels of classes, need to work on not just individual signs but also their facial expression, the facial grammar, otherwise they're not going to be understood. So people sometimes underestimate what's required of them when they're learning a sign language. It's a language of your whole body, not just a language of your hands. And the movement of your face, the movement of your body is crucial to signing. Often you have a situation where a hearing person is signing to a deaf person, and the deaf person asks their friend, what's he talking about? So it's very important practicing and teaching and developing sign language instruction. And when they see a deaf person signing and communicating, that can help hearing people to develop. Some people, there are cultural differences. Some hearing people don't like to move their bodies and move their faces in a way that they need to in order to sign properly. But it's really important because if they're in a court setting or they're in some other kind of professional setting, they need to be able to communicate clearly with their deaf client. So if it's a crime situation, you're going to need to move your body and use your facial expression and use all of your body in order to transmit the information clearly. And people also can't be shy about that. Sometimes hearing people are very shy when they're signing and they feel self-conscious about how they're moving. But it's very important that you have that contact, and that contact includes the face, and that's how you communicate clearly. And sign language classes are good, but I want to be honest with you. What's much better is involvement in a deaf community. That's how you really learn. That's how you really understand. I had a friend, for example, at church. He'd never been to a sign language class in his life before, but he would line with deaf people, he would go by deaf people's houses, and he would pick things up. And after really just a few weeks, he was signing natively, just after a few weeks. So really classes, you might take a class for several weeks, but what's really important is involvement in a deaf community. That's much better than being in a class. So whenever you want to learn about sign language or learn about deafness, you have to be involved in a deaf community. And I'd like to add that, what you learn in a sign language class might be quite different from what you learn outside in a deaf community, in real life, when you're actually mixing with real deaf people. We talked about American Sign Language and Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, and both of those might be used, but they might be used in different contexts. So I have an experience before. I was working as a teacher for infants in the deaf school. And so sometimes what I would have to do is pick up new signs. People would be using new signs, and I combine them with the old signs, and I would put things together, and sometimes have to translate things from one way of signing into another way of signing. So again, that's why it's important to be involved in a deaf community. And we've been working this year and in the past on deaf awareness. This month, September, there was International Week of the Deaf. And one of the things that we did was in Movie Town, we had a deaf awareness tent. We had various kinds of deaf awareness activities, talking about sign language, communication. We were selling t-shirts, alphabet posters, things like that, and talking about sign language and deaf communities in the Caribbean. And that's something that's connected with the World Federation of the Deaf, which is an international organisation. And the theme of that event was full inclusion with sign language, which seems very appropriate. So we hope that having seen our presentation, you might want to take more interest. We saw that women face discrimination as gender-based discrimination. We feel like there are opportunities for partnerships, for working together, partnering with the deaf community. We'll be very happy if anyone here is interested in doing that. So we'd like to thank you very much, and then open the floor if anyone has any questions, or we'll see if we have any answers. Please ask away.
Thank you so much. The floor is open.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. This is the first one I have actually ever attended, and I'm happy to be here. My question is, your workshops that you have, that you mentioned about, who are your target audience? Like, who was those workshops catered for? Is it like what age range? The reason I'm asking is because we do a lot of work on child sexual abuse, and I'm looking to see how I see potential collaboration here with sex ed with children in the deaf community.
Yeah, in the past we had a partnership with the Ministry of Social Development with some of these workshops. Ministry of Families and Social Development. Yeah. And the workshops have in the past mostly included adults, mostly been aimed at adults and teenagers. But I think we really do need work with children as well, early education, early information for people, because there really isn't very much of that as well. That's something that we're really very interested in as a future project.
Great. No, thanks.
Are you saving?
Ian wants to just add one thing. And maybe we could collaborate through the schools, or deaf schools, Cascade School for the Deaf, and the school in Marabella as well.
That was what I'm getting at, because we recently did some work with the Ministry of Education as well, and I think at our next meeting with the Ministry of Education, I would want to raise that as a key point for consideration as well. How do we include that community? You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, the woman over there.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Like Tricia, this is the first time I have been in a forum like this, and I also found it very, very enlightening. But why I put my hand up, you mentioned about being involved in a couple of marches this year. In particular, I want to talk about the International Women's Day March, that you said there were some challenges to your organization's participation. So I'm part of the organizing team for next year. So we're starting early, and I really want to know who are the persons that I need to engage, so to ensure that there's a full complement with banners, posters representing both or all three organizations. So I don't know if we can have a short conversation when we're through, so we can get contact details. That would be wonderful.
Absolutely, that would be great. That would be great. We can give you email contacts and all kinds of things. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Awesome. I can't see very well, so if you could talk, it would be easier for me.
Okay.
Sorry.
Asking about, Cheryl, earlier you were explaining about the use of sign names, and you mentioned that in addition to using the handshake, deaf people tend to study a deaf person and then they add something related to the characteristic of a deaf person. In terms of gender and discrimination, I'm wondering if you see any concerns for the use of sign names and there being an emphasis on physical characteristics. For example, I remember years ago teaching at a school, and you had a teacher with a sizable hip, and deaf people, the sign name was connected with that, or different parts of the body that we tend to, that could have some concern bordering on discrimination or focusing on aspects of the female that, I don't know, I'm trying to say how to phrase that. But.
No, I think that it's not a bad thing. This is just how this is a part of deaf culture. This is how deaf people do things. That is how deaf people will understand who you're talking about. If there's a physical characteristic that's particularly clear, say the way the person moves, the way the person walks, you might mimic that, and that's the way to make someone understand who you're talking about. Or you might have sign names because someone is... someone has an eye facing a funny direction, or they have dark skin, or they have big hair, or they have a big bottom. There are deaf people with these kinds of sign names all around, and hearing people probably as well. And the kind of descriptions that hearing people use to describe people tend not to work very well for for deaf people. The kind of descriptions that hearing people use when they're describing don't really match the way that deaf people describe people. And it might seem very blunt, and it might seem strange to hearing people, but that's the way it is with deaf people. And it's not always about the person's body. Sometimes it might be about the way that they move. Say, for example, Ben, for example, his sign name, the reason he's like this is because this is what he looks like, this is what he does. His eyes kind of like not making eye contact and looking down at the floor. So it's really to do with someone's character as well, usually. Oh, it might be to do with their hobbies or what they're interested in or something like that as well sometimes. Or something that they love. So someone who loves cooking, for example, always cooking for people, then you might give them a sign name that corresponds to that. So it's not always those kind of things. And usually deaf people don't do it straight away. They'll quite often wait a bit, get to know someone, and then they'll come up with the sign name that they find is appropriate. So it sometimes takes time. It's not something that happens immediately. Once you get to know someone, then you might give them a sign name.
Hi, good day. I'm interested in two questions. One would be, I know the Roman Catholic Church has a deep investment in the deaf community in Trinidad and Tobago, but I admired how you identified issues of trans persons as well as child sexual abuse, and I would like to know if you could speak to conservatism in the deaf community, and does that suppress some of the voices? And that is tied to the second question. What are the expressions of the political activism of the community beyond deaf issues? What is the kind of activism do persons in the deaf community take up politically?
Okay, so your first question was about, like LGBT issues. There are some, of course, there are gay and lesbian people in the deaf community involved in the scene.
Presence of deaf clubs,
Yeah.
gay and lesbian clubs.
But it tends to be kept private. It tends to be something that's not out in the open. So there are lots of deaf gay and lesbian people who spend a lot of time in gay and lesbian clubs. In terms of politics, in the past there's an organisation called the Trinidad and Tobago Association for the Hearing Impaired, which receives a lot of money from the government, and it was we set up our organisation DEAF because that organisation wasn't really doing what it was supposed to be doing, and since then we've been partnering. They've been improving somewhat, so we've been partnering with them and trying to work within the work to try to educate the people in power, the politicians, the people in government, about understanding deaf awareness, about understanding sign languages, about understanding the need for equality, the need to not treat people with pity, the need to give people independence, the need to recognise their skills and their abilities, and need for educational access and development. I'll just add to that. Yeah, I think that church groups have played a really big role in the history and development of the deaf community in Trinidad and Tobago. The first school was set up by Anglican priest from England who came over here. He helped to set it up, and that tradition has gone through for a long time. There are lots of missionaries all across the Caribbean who are targeting deaf populations, and I think that definitely has an effect on attitudes to many kinds of issues and sort of intersecting issues of diversity. I don't know that I want to say any more than that, but it's an issue, definitely. Yeah, and I think there's maybe more partnerships and more work that could be done with other organisations to try to develop different understandings. Appreciation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Just to reiterate what Tricia and also Yolanda both said, the IGDS, the Institute for Gender, we're very committed to moving forward in partnership with you all to make sure that we are taking these issues into consideration and that we have better planning. Because the last March in particular was a very hurried experience. I was on that planning committee. It was a very stressful experience because of all the different things, all the different groups and organizations. And so, we really regret that we did not take into account accessibility.
No problem.
Yes,
Like
no, I just want to say it because it's something that we've been talking about since then, and acknowledge that we are starting early this year, and Yolanda, who is super amazing, is going to make sure we're on point with a variety of issues. And so, but even beyond that too, Milka's point about sexuality and thinking about ways that we can, I think, better attend to these issues. There's so many different ways that I think we can partner, and we can invite you all back to be a part of conversations. But in my work in particular, I work with LGBT organizations, and we are doing a project about LGBT rights and protection, and also issues on gender-based violence and LGBTI bias. So I would love to find out ways that we can connect, support, and make sure that we're including the deaf community in our conversations about these issues of sexuality.
Okay, great, wonderful. And a good way of reaching out to the deaf community is if you have information that you want to share, Ian can make a video and share it on Facebook, and that reaches everyone in the deaf community.
Okay.
And also, every month we have a deaf general meeting as well. Our organisation has a general meeting as well, so we'd be happy if you came along to one of those. Usually the second or third week of the month.
Any other questions?
Start a club. So you're talking with your friend about the idea of starting a club. We have a sign language class at the moment. And I meet people at UE, and they always say they're interested, they want to learn sign language, they want to learn TTSL and ASL maybe. But there aren't enough classes. law and science and language students. Students from different faculties who are interested in sign language classes. And I'm trying to encourage them to socialise with deaf people. And maybe partnership with, I missed that one. Oh, IGDS, right, yeah. Yeah, well, maybe one of the things that we can do is share information about deaf events and encourage people to go to those events. We can share contact details and work together more in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for being here with us today.
Cheryl wants to say thank you very much for coming. We're really happy to see you, and thank you for supporting us. It's really wonderful, and I hope that together we'll be stronger together in partnership, as in the future we support each other and help our country, Trinidad and Tobago, to develop together. Okay, and I love you all. If you want to clap the deaf way, you clap like this. So.